Let's begin the third section of Chapter 9, America in World War I. The first two sections dealt with the reasons for the outbreak of the war, the four causes: nationalism, imperialism, militarism, and the alliance system. Section 2 dealt with how and why we got into the war, and Section 3 deals with the highlights of the war. And so we'll look at some of the key people, some of the key events of America in World War I. Okay, so shortly after joining the war, after we declared war in 1917, America sent a force of American troops known as the American Expeditionary Force. These were sent to Europe, and of course, President Woodrow Wilson, who was the commander-in-chief, ordered these troops to be raised. We didn't have much of an army at this time, only a few 100,000 men, so we had to raise an army and train them, and that army that we sent to Europe to fight would be the AEF. The AEF was put under the command of General John J. Pershing, known as Black Jack Pershing, a West Point graduate. Pershing had fought in the Indian Wars. He fought at the Battle of San Juan Hill in the Spanish-American War. I wouldn't say necessarily along the side of Teddy Roosevelt, but he was there. He had fought against the Filipino rebels after we had won the war against Spain in the Spanish-American War. There was a rebellion by Filipino rebels. We talked about this in the last chapter, I believe it was. And Pershing fought in that war. War is probably the wrong word. Rebellion. There were 100,000 or more dead Filipinos and thousands of Americans who died in the conflict. So again, he has some experience. And then, of course, we talked about this also. He led the expedition into Mexico against Pancho Villa, and this would be in 1917. Okay, I'm sorry. He led against Pancho Villa a few years earlier. Before the beginning of the war, in 1917. There we go. Pershing insisted that the American soldiers be well trained before being sent to the Western Front. And so this was something he believed in, that the soldiers be well trained, well equipped, properly prepared before going to combat. And because of this, he, the leader of the American forces, the American forces themselves, lost fewer men. The better trained, the better equipped you are, the more likely you are to survive any type of combat situation. So as a result of this, being better trained, spending the time and the money to train our men, American troops arrived before 1918. I'm sorry, rephrase that. Clear that up a little bit. There we go. As a result of this, few, I think there's a key word that we need to concentrate on for this particular sentence. Few troops arrived before 1918. The bulk of our troops arrived after 1918 began. Pershing also demanded that American forces fight together under his control, under his command, and not be used to fill the gaps in the French and the British armies. He did not want our troops to be plugged into French forces or British forces just to sort of fill a gap, because they've lost a great deal of men as a result of the war. And because of this, the American forces were able to stay together, fight together as a unit, and they were highly effective. By 1918, over 1 million American men, American soldiers, had made it to Europe. The AEF was over 1 million. There would be essentially another million who get to the war by the time of the end of the war. We had about 2 million men in theater by the end of the war. The AEF suffered more than 250,000 casualties. That is dead and wounded, including more than 50,000 who were killed in battle. So we had a little over 50,000 dead, and we had a little over 200,000 who were wounded in combat. Now, this seems like a lot. 250,000 men is a lot. That's a huge number, but keep in mind, when you compare that to the numbers of men, that should be a zero there. Yeah, 250,000. Again, it's more than that. Just round it to that number because it's an easy number to remember. Keep in mind that the war had been going on before we got there for 2.5 to almost 3 years, and the number of dead and wounded prior to our full involvement was probably about 17, 18 million dead and wounded prior to our involvement. Total, over 20 million dead as a result of the war, and probably had a few more million who were wounded. So our numbers, 250,000, seem not like a whole lot when you compare it to them, but by our standards, it's a lot of men. President Wilson refused to allow African American regiments to serve in the AEF. But 2 of those regiments, all black, all African American regiments, served under French command. We still had a lot of issues over color. President Woodrow Wilson was a good man in some ways. He was debatable as to a military leader or even a president. There are a number of people today who look back upon his legacy as a progressive president, and there are many who look back upon his legacy as a commander-in-chief and kind of go, no. There has been a lot of talk recently with some of the events that are unfolding at some of the college campuses, Missouri, for example, the University of Missouri, some of the things that have occurred, and I think we discussed them previously, where Woodrow Wilson's racism has sort of come to the foreground and become a huge topic. Whether that's the case or not is not really relevant to what we're discussing, but it has, I think, been proven relatively sufficiently that he was a racist. And this is not uncommon back in the early 19-teens. And we're not going to get there now. We may get into it later. But for right now, we'll stick to this. But was it his racism that kept these African Americans, and we had well over 100,000 who served in the military at this time, was it his racism that kept these blacks out of the military, keep them out of serving with the American group, and then allowed them to serve with the French? I don't know. But it is something that may deserve a little bit more conversation later on. Okay, the Battle of the Argonne Forest. Let's move forward. This is the greatest battle, the best-known battle of the entire war. This occurred in 1918, Battle of Argonne Forest, which is in the northeastern part of France near the Belgian border. In fact, it is on the border with Belgium, and part of the forest is in Belgium, part of the forest is in France. The Germans had spent several years fortifying their positions in the forest, which the Germans, believed were unassailable, which means that they were unpenetrable, that they were pretty well made. The terrain was steep. Clear that up. There we go. Steep, with barely a flat. By the way, that should be the word flat. I'm sorry, that should be an L there. Flat. That just makes it look worse, doesn't it? That's just a typo. I apologize for that, but that should be flat. That doesn't help either. You know what? I'm going to stop doing that. You just know it's flat. A flat piece of land. So it was pretty steep. And of course, it is a forest, hence the name, the Argonne Forest. And so it was pretty steep, and it was difficult to maneuver. One general remarked that it was a region of forgotten okay. This doesn't make a lot of sense the way it is here. I don't know what happened when this was being translated or moved from the form it was into the Word document. A region that was forgotten when level ground was being created. So he just said that when God made the earth and he made all the level land, he just did not get around to the Argonne Forest being level. Okay. German defenses included miles of barbed wire, often hidden in the underbrush. Okay, pretty formidable defensive position right there. There were also high concrete walls to block the progress of tanks, and deep pit traps to which the tanks might fall. Okay, doesn't sound good. And of course, machine guns, machine gun nests is a term that is used. Machine gun nest, oftentimes hidden inside a steel concrete bunker. It could be hidden in some foliage, in some of this brush, in the underbrush, and of course usually it was fortified with at least sandbags, well hidden, well thought out defensive position. They were everywhere. So the Argonne Forest was steep, dense woods with a great deal of defensive positions in place. Those defensive positions included barbed wire, tank traps, and machine guns. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. The AEF under General Pershing assembled about 600,000 soldiers and 40,000 pieces of artillery. They fought through the hilly terrain, shattering the German defenses and opened a hole in the German lines. The final and most important battle of the AEF lasted a month and a half, about 6 weeks. A total of 1.2 million Americans were involved in the campaign from the beginning to the end, of which 117,000 were killed or wounded. I think this is also one of the vocabulary terms we went over a week or so ago. So 1.2 million were involved, 117,000 casualties, dead and wounded. Okay, let's move on to something else here. Still talking about the Battle of Argonne Forest. It was the attempt of the Allies to push through the Argonne Forest into Germany, an offensive against the Germans to force the Germans to surrender. It was a huge battle. Well over 1 million Americans participated, and it defeated the American AEF. The American forces defeated the Germans, pushing them back into Germany, essentially putting them on the run. Of the 1.2 million Americans who fought, 117,000 casualties. Now, during the Civil War, Congress created what they called the Medal of Honor for officers and non-commissioned soldiers who most distinguished themselves by gallantry in action. Now, this gallantry in action has really no literal definition. It can mean any number of things, and we'll talk about Alvin York in just a moment. We've already discussed it, but I'm going to go back into it again. This is the definition of gallantry in action. It could be any number of things. You are a soldier and you do something extraordinary, save the lives of your entire platoon by taking out several machine gun nests. I mean, any number of things can and do fall under this category of gallantry in action. More than 3,400 soldiers have been awarded this medal, which is the highest award we, the United States, can give to a soldier. Now, one of those who received this was Alvin York. Those are the years of his life. A devoted Bible reader. He almost avoided military service as a conscientious objector, which means that his religion does not allow him to participate in war. There are a number of religions that are so strong in this belief. Now, all religions are pretty much against war, but there are certain churches, certain religions that are above and beyond that. And as a member of one of those religious sects, York could have gotten out as a conscientious objector. He was drafted at the age of 29, and he went in and basically told them that, no, I can't do this because my religious beliefs. His commanding officer gave him a choice: let him go home, let him talk to his friends, his family, his preacher. He came back from that brief time away from the military and said, yeah, I believe I should serve. And he did. In many ways, he was pretty typical of the draftees. He was underprivileged and undereducated. He came from the back hills of Tennessee. He probably never owned a pair of shoes until he was a teenager. But he could hunt, and he could fish, and he could track, and he is a perfect soldier. Much like the American Revolution, he and the soldiers of the American Revolution made their living or were able to survive by being able to hunt. And he was a crack shot. He was used to being outdoors. And the underprivileged, uneducated stuff, that's pretty typical of America at that time. Now, of course, that has changed as we have required mandatory schooling up to the age of 18, through the 12th grade, blah, blah, blah. But he was pretty typical of that day. He was not typical in the sense that he was really a born soldier. His environment growing up made him a perfect soldier. Anyway, the draftees who were sent to France, they were sent there to make the world safe for democracy. Okay, pretty simple stuff. We felt that the bad guys, the German, Austrian side, were attempting to enslave, through imperialism, enslave Europe. Anyway, to get back to this, so York was one of several million who was sent there from the United States, part of the AEF, in the Battle of Argonne Forest. Again, we talked about that about a few moments ago. With nothing more than his rifle and his pistol, He reportedly killed 25 Germans and captured 132 prisoners. Now, we've already discussed this. I'm not going to go into more depth into how and why that was done right now. We've already talked about that. But with a little more than a rifle and a pistol, and the rifle being a bolt-action rifle, not a full automatic as we have today, but with a bolt-action rifle, he was able to kill 25 Germans, and he captured 132 prisoners all by himself. For that, he was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor and pretty much every other award that every nation on the Allied side had to give. Okay, another slide or two will be done with this section, the home front. 1917, 1918, the years that we were in the war. To fight the war, President Wilson was given sweeping powers by Congress, and this is not uncommon. In any wartime event, any warlike situation, the president, the executive branch, takes on more power. And Wilson was not afraid to use it. He established several agencies to regulate the economy during the war. Railroads were placed under direct government control. Congress passed the Selective Service Act, one of our vocabulary terms, and millions of Americans were registered for the draft. And over 2 million troops eventually reached Europe. Not all were drafted. Probably about a fourth were volunteers, but we did draft well over 1 million, probably 1.5 million men. And eventually, of all the men who served, about 2 million made their way to Europe, while women and African Americans filled many of their jobs at home. So we had 1.5 million drafted, give or take a few thousand. We had about 500,000 who volunteered, and so we're looking really at about 2 million, give or take, probably a little bit more than that, but around 2 million in uniform, and their jobs back home had to be filled. So what did we do? We went to two groups who were usually excluded from the workforce, women and blacks. They served at home in the jobs that the men who were not in uniform had once done. So women took the place of their fathers, their husbands, their brothers in the factories, in the fields. Same thing with blacks. And this is referred to, as far as the African Americans go, as the Great Migration. I think one of our vocabulary terms. We had tens of thousands of young blacks move from the south to the north, seeking employment, full-time employment in the factories of the north, in the meat packing industry, in the textile industry, and all those other different industries that were now growing, and all those industries that now needed workers because of the 2 million men who were in uniform. The cost of the war was about $30 billion. Now again, this is $30 billion in 1918 money. We're probably looking at upwards of several 800, 900 billion, probably in the trillions, $1 trillion plus dollars in today's dollars. We're talking a fabulous amount of money. But most of the cost of the war was paid for by higher taxes and selling of war bonds. The war greatly benefited the American economy. Lots of people were working. Lots of people who before had been excluded from work, like women and African Americans, who were excluded from the average job. Most, again, women at this time were, I think we've discussed previously, housewives and mothers, and African Americans were primarily field hands in the South. And now we have two groups who were underrepresented in the economy are now a huge part of the economy. So the war greatly benefited our economy because of the people working, and we exported tons, literally tons. I can't even begin to guess how many tons of equipment, food, weapons, munitions, clothing, medicines. We exported those to our Allied friends. During the Civil War, civil liberties were curtailed to meet the wartime needs. Now, this again is nothing new. Abraham Lincoln, during the Civil War, suspended habeas corpus and shut down a number of newspapers who were not flattering to him or the North's war effort. And so in 1917, the Espionage Act was passed. I realize it's a little bit difficult to see there with the word dossier. I'm sorry about that. I think we've already discussed this in vocabulary terms. But the Espionage Act made it a crime to criticize the war effort. So, is it uncommon for the government to do things to suppress opposition during war times? No, it is not uncommon. It's happened numerous times. And this is just an example of that. I believe we have a couple more slides. Wilson's 14 points. President Wilson broadened American war aims for defense of freedom from a freedom of the seas to crusade to make the world safe for democracy. So originally we had hoped to create an environment where freedom of the seas was respected by all, and the word crusade is used, and I think it's used correctly. Keep in mind, Wilson was a progressive. He believed in fixing societal problems through the legislative process. He wanted to make the world safe for democracies. Okay, not a bad goal. I think many of us here believe that's a noble cause. America's found it inspiring to endure the war for such high-minded ideals. We didn't mind the sacrifices many people made. I mean, I'm not talking about the soldiers who lost their lives or lost a limb, the couple 100,000 couple 100,000 wounded, or the 50+ thousand dead, or the fact that we had to conserve at home. No, we're not talking about, we are sort of talking about those things. Those are some of the things we had to endure. The loss of life, the loss of money, okay, because it did cost a lot of money. But we found that the concept of making the world safe for democracy, we found that concept to be something worthy of our time and pain. In January of 18, really just a few months before the war ends, Wilson delivered his speech, 14-point speech, in a joint session of Congress. The 14 points stated that each major European nationality, like the Poles, the people from Poland, would be given their own country and government. And of course, we expect that government to be democratic. Austria, Hungary, and the Ottoman empires were therefore to be divided up, and several new nation states were to be created. Poland was to be reborn, and I'm not gonna butcher that. The Lorraine, I'm sorry, I don't speak French. If any of you do, you can go ahead and yell it out right now. Go ahead, 1, 2, 3, go. I guess not. Anyway, was returned to France. Okay, these are all part of his 14 points. His 14 points also introduced several other changes to increase international cooperation, and this was very important, he felt, to creating a world that was safe for democracy, to create a world where we would not have another world war. Some of these changes would be a call for the freedom of the seas, a reduction of armaments, and the removal of trade barriers. Pretty important stuff. I think most importantly, he wanted to, and this is the last one mentioned here, an anti-secret diplomacy. That secret diplomacy is, of course, the alliance system.